It is 2:14 a.m. when the prepaid burner phone finally connects. A hollow dial tone rings out in the freezing darkness of a shattered living room. Sarah presses the cheap plastic to her bruised cheek, her left arm hanging uselessly at a sickening, unnatural angle. She doesn't dare call 911. The dispatcher in this corrupt borough is cousin to the man who just broke her bones. Instead, she dials the 11 digits, sharply penned onto a diner receipt. A man answers on the second ring. His voice is a low, dangerous rumble that promises absolute destruction. She chokes back a ragged sob and whispers into the receiver, "Please come get me." The neon sign outside Mel's 24-hour diner on Route 17 flickered with a persistent, annoying hum. It cast a sickly, intermittent red glow over the cracked vinyl seats of booth number 4. For Sarah Bennett, that booth was the only anchor in a life that was rapidly spiraling out of control. Sarah was 24, but the exhaustion etched into the corners of her eyes made her look a decade older. She smelled perpetually of stale coffee grounds, cheap industrial bleach, and the lingering scent of old fryer grease. But the worst part of her reality wasn't the diner. It was the man waiting for her in the dingy ground-floor apartment at 442 Sycamore Drive. Kyle Barrett. Kyle had once been charming, a small-time mechanic with a crooked smile and big dreams, but the dreams had soured, replaced by a devastating gambling addiction and a terrifying temper. In the span of 2 years, Kyle had gambled away his garage, Sarah's modest inheritance from her grandmother, Sylvia Carmichael, and finally, his own humanity. He was currently deep in debt to the O'Bannon brothers, local, ruthless loan sharks who didn't ask politely for their money. Kyle took his fear and his failures out on Sarah. The bruises on her ribs were a secret she guarded fiercely beneath her oversized polyester diner uniform. Then came Vincent Costa. Vincent was not a man who belonged in a rundown roadside diner in the dead of night. He wore custom-tailored charcoal suits that cost more than Sarah made in a year. His shoes were polished Italian leather, and the heavy gold watch on his wrist caught the harsh fluorescent light with an arrogant gleam. He was the head of the Costa Syndicate, the undisputed kingpin of the city's underground operations. The local police commissioner, Arthur Pendleton, practically ate out of his hand. Vincent controlled the docks, the high-end casinos, and the political machinery of the entire district. Yet every Tuesday and Thursday night at exactly 11:30 p.m., Vincent Costa walked into Mel's, bypassed the front counter, and slid into booth number 4. He always came alone, though Sarah often spotted a sleek, black town car idling in the darkest corner of the parking lot, occupied by men who looked like they were carved from stone. He never looked at a menu. He ordered black coffee and a slice of cherry pie, and he watched Sarah. He didn't watch her with the leering, hungry eyes of the late-night truckers or the drunk college kids. He watched her with a cold, calculating intensity. He noticed everything. He noticed the slight wince when she reached for the high shelf to grab extra sugar packets. He noticed the yellowing shadow of makeup she used to cover the fading mark on her jawline. One rainy Thursday night, the diner was completely empty except for Vincent. Sarah approached his table with the glass coffee pot, her hands trembling slightly. Kyle had been particularly volatile that morning, throwing a heavy glass ashtray that had narrowly missed her temple, shattering against the kitchen wall. Her nerves were entirely shot. "Refill, Mr. Costa?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Vincent didn't look at the cup. He looked directly into her eyes. His gaze was entirely devoid of warmth, yet it held a strange, heavy gravity. "Your hands are shaking, Sarah." Just a lot of caffeine tonight," she lied, offering a fragile, unconvincing smile. Vincent reached out. He didn't grab her, but he placed his large, calloused hand flat on the table, just inches from hers. A man who hits a woman is a coward who has lost control of his own life, Vincent said, his voice a smooth, lethal baritone. He strikes out because he is weak, and weak men eventually cross the wrong people. Sarah froze, the coffee pot hovering in the air. Her heart hammered against her bruised ribs. I don't know what you're talking about. Vincent withdrew a sleek, silver pen from his breast pocket. He pulled the receipt she had placed on the table earlier and flipped it over. With deliberate, precise strokes, he wrote down a phone number. He pushed the slip of paper across the Formica tabletop. My private line, Vincent said, his dark eyes locking onto hers, stripping away all her defenses. You do not call the police. You do not call an ambulance. If the day comes when the coward goes too far, you call me. Do you understand? Sarah stared at the paper as if it were a live grenade. Why? Why would you help me? Vincent stood up, leaving a crisp, folded $100 bill beside his half-eaten pie. Because I despise weak men, Sarah, and because you make terrible coffee, but you have a kind soul. Keep the paper. That was 3 weeks ago. She had hidden the receipt inside the battery compartment of an old, prepaid burner phone she kept stashed beneath the loose floorboard under her bed, her secret escape fund, the only thing keeping her sane. The rain was coming down in sheets when Sarah finally unlocked the door to Unit 3B on Sycamore Drive. It was 1 a.m. on a Tuesday. She was bone-tired, her feet throbbing, dreaming only of a hot shower and a few hours of dreamless sleep. The moment the door clicked shut behind her, she knew something was violently wrong. The apartment was entirely dark, but she could smell the sour stench of cheap whiskey and the metallic tang of fear. The living room had been torn apart. Sofa cushions were sliced open, stuffing spilling onto the stained carpet. Drawers from the small writing desk were pulled out and dumped onto the floor. Kyle, she called out, her voice trembling. A shadow detached itself from the corner of the kitchen. Kyle stumbled forward, his eyes wild and bloodshot. He looked like a cornered animal. In his hand, he held a small, rusted metal lockbox. It was the box she had hidden under the floorboards, the box that contained her burner phone, Vincent's number, and the $2,400 she had painstakingly saved in tips over 2 years to finally run away. He had broken the lock. The money was clutched in his other fist. The burner phone and the receipt had been tossed carelessly onto the kitchen counter. You holding out on me, you stupid bitch? Kyle spat, his voice cracking with manic energy. I'm drowning here. I owe Tommy O'Bannon 50 grand by midnight, and you're sitting on a pile of cash. Kyle, please, that's everything I have, Sarah pleaded, taking a step back, her hands raised in surrender. That's my way out. Please don't take it. Your way out? Kyle laughed, a sharp, hysterical sound. Nobody gets out, Sarah. Tommy told me what he's going to do to me if I don't pay. He's going to take my fingers. He's going to take my eyes. He shoved the money into his leather jacket. Sarah, driven by a sudden, desperate surge of adrenaline, lunged forward. She grabbed the collar of his jacket, trying to rip the money back. It was a foolish, fatal mistake. Kyle roared in anger. He backhanded her across the face with devastating force. Sarah stumbled backward, her vision exploding into white-hot stars, tasting copper as her lips split open. She crashed into the heavy oak coffee table, falling hard onto the carpet. Before she could scramble away, Kyle was on top of her. He wasn't just angry anymore. He was utterly frantic, driven mad by the ticking clock of his own debts. He pinned her left arm to the floor with his knee. You think you're better than me? You think you can just leave me here to die? He screamed, spittle flying onto her face. Kyle, stop! You're hurting me! Sarah shrieked, thrashing wildly. He grabbed her left wrist with both hands. He didn't just twist it, he used the leverage of his body weight and jerked it upward at a vicious, unnatural angle, while keeping her elbow pinned to the floor with his boot. The sound in the small apartment was deafening. It wasn't a crack, it was a wet, heavy snap. The radius and ulnar bones gave way simultaneously. Sarah's scream tore through her throat, echoing off the thin walls of the apartment complex. The pain was absolute, a blinding, consuming fire that radiated from her forearm straight into her brain. She convulsed, her vision going black at the edges as she vomited a mixture of bile and diner coffee onto the carpet. Kyle jumped back, suddenly terrified by the horrific angle of her arm. He stared at his hands, then at her, his chest heaving. "Look what you made me do," he stammered, his bravado entirely gone, replaced by a pathetic, whining cowardice. "You shouldn't have grabbed me." Sarah couldn't speak. She lay curled in a fetal position, clutching her right hand over her shattered left arm, sobbing uncontrollably. Kyle looked around frantically. He grabbed her actual cell phone from her purse, smashed it under his heel, and kicked the pieces across the room. "I have to go. Tommy's waiting." "Don't call the cops, Sarah. If you call the cops, I'll tell them you attacked me with a knife." He didn't look back as he bolted out the front door, slamming it shut behind him, leaving her entirely alone in the darkness. Time lost all meaning. Sarah lay on the floor for what felt like hours, riding wave after wave of nauseating agony. Her left arm was swelling rapidly, the skin turning a sickly, mottled purple. If she moved even a fraction of an inch, the broken bones grated against each other, threatening to make her pass out. She had no phone, no neighbors who cared enough to check on a scream. Domestic disputes were just background noise on Sycamore Drive. Then, through the haze of pain, she remembered. She dragged herself across the carpet, inch by agonizing inch, using only her right arm and her legs. She left a smear of blood from her split lip on the floorboards. She reached the kitchen counter. She couldn't stand, so she used her right hand to pull the kitchen stool down, knocking the burner phone and the folded diner receipt onto the floor. With trembling, blood-stained fingers, she punched in the numbers. Vincent Costa was sitting at the head of a massive mahogany table in the private, soundproofed back room of the Velvet Lounge. The air was thick with cigar smoke and the heavy tension of a syndicate war council. His underboss, a ruthless enforcer named Carmine Valetti, was in the middle of a heated rant about the O'Bannon brothers encroaching on their dockside shipments. Suddenly, the encrypted satellite phone resting beside Vincent's crystal glass of bourbon lit up. It vibrated silently. The entire room went dead quiet. Very few people had that number. The men at the table, seasoned killers and hardened extortionists, watched as their Don picked up the device. Vincent answered it. He didn't say a word. He just listened. Through the receiver, he heard the shallow, ragged breathing. Then, a voice, small and broken, choked with sobs. "Please, please come get me." Vincent's posture didn't change, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The dark, calculated calm in his eyes shattered, replaced by a cold, murderous void. He stood up slowly, buttoning his suit jacket. "Carmine," Vincent said, his voice terrifyingly soft. "Get the armored SUV. Bring Silvio and Dante. We are leaving immediately." "Boss, the O'Bannon meeting." "Cancel it," Vincent cut him off, walking toward the door. "We have a pest control issue on Sycamore Drive." 15 minutes later, the black SUV slammed over the curb outside Sarah's apartment complex. The rain was torrential now. Vincent didn't wait for his men to open his door. He stepped out into the downpour, his designer suit instantly soaked, his face a mask of stone. Silvio, a mountain of a man who served as Vincent's primary muscle, kicked the front door of Unit 3B off its hinges with a single, devastating strike. The wood splintered, and the door crashed into the hallway. Vincent stepped inside. He took in the trashed apartment in a fraction of a second. Then his eyes fell on Sarah. She was curled against the kitchen cabinets, pale as a ghost, shivering violently from shock. Her left arm was deformed, the sleeve of her shirt stretched tight over the horrific swelling. When she saw Vincent, her breath hitched, and a fresh wave of tears spilled down her bruised cheeks. Vincent crossed the room instantly. He didn't care about the blood or the vomit on the floor. He dropped to his knees in his $1,000 suit and gently hovered his hands over her, afraid to touch her and cause more pain. "Sarah," he said, his voice dropping the lethal edge, becoming astonishingly gentle. "I'm here." "I have you." "He broke it," she sobbed, her teeth chattering. "He took the money and he broke it." Vincent looked up at Silvio, who was standing by the doorway. Silvio saw the look in his Don's eyes and instantly pulled his customized Glock from his shoulder holster, checking the chamber. "Dante," Vincent ordered without looking away from Sarah. "Call Dr. Rossi. Tell him to prep the private clinic at the estate. We are coming in hot." Vincent carefully slid his right arm beneath Sarah's knees and his left arm around her back, supporting her neck. He lifted her as easily as if she weighed nothing. Sarah buried her face into the damp wool of his suit jacket, inhaling the scent of expensive cologne and rain. As Vincent turned to leave, Dante, who had been sweeping the back rooms, walked into the living room, holding a flashing, cheap cassette answering machine. "Boss," Dante said, his voice tight. "You need to hear this. The boyfriend didn't just run." Vincent paused. Dante pressed the play button. The recording hissed, and then a thick, mocking Irish brogue filled the room. It was Tommy O'Bannon. Well, Kyle. I gotta admit, you surprised me. 50 grand is a lot of money. But giving us the Costa Syndicate's favorite little diner waitress? That's a hell of a bargaining chip. We've been watching Loverboy Vincent at that diner for weeks. The boys are heading to Sycamore Drive right now to pick up our new prize. Your debt is cleared, Kyle. Enjoy your miserable life. The machine clicked off. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the room, broken only by Sarah's whimpers. Kyle hadn't just stolen her money to pay his debt. He had sold her out to Vincent's greatest enemies, knowing they would use her as leverage against the Mafia boss. Vincent looked down at Sarah, who was trembling violently against his chest, her eyes wide with fresh terror. He tightened his grip on her slightly, a silent promise of absolute protection. He slowly looked back up at Dante and Silvio. The gentle savior was gone. The architect of the Costa Syndicate had returned, and he was ready for war. "Silvio," Vincent commanded, his voice echoing like a death knell in the cramped apartment. "Call Carmine. Tell him to mobilize every soldier we have. The O'Bannons are coming here. Let them come. And when they arrive, I want you to burn this entire street to the ash." He carried Sarah out into the storm, the rain washing the blood from the pavement, as the distant sound of approaching engines bled into the night. The heavy deluge of rain drumming against the roof of the armored Mercedes-Benz G-Class did little to drown out the screech of tires echoing down Sycamore Drive. Vincent Costa placed Sarah onto the plush leather of the back seat with a surprising, terrifying gentleness. Her skin was clammy, her face entirely drained of color as she cradled her grossly deformed left arm against her chest. She was going into systemic shock, her breaths coming in short, ragged gasps. "Hold on to me," Vincent murmured, his voice a low, steady anchor in the swirling chaos of her pain. He slid in beside her, pulling her uninjured side against the soaked lapel of his custom Brioni suit. He did not care about the blood seeping into the expensive wool. He cared only that her violent shivering was beginning to subside against his body heat. Outside, the street rapidly devolved into a war zone. 2 rusted, heavy-duty pickup trucks, the signature vehicles of the O'Bannon crew, slammed to a halt on either side of the narrow street, effectively boxing in the Costa Syndicate's SUV. The blinding glare of their high beams cut through the torrential rain, illuminating the broken front door of Unit 3B. Tommy O'Bannon, a thick-necked enforcer with a scarred chin and a taste for cheap violence, stepped out of the lead truck. He was flanked by 6 men carrying illegal, fully automatic weapons. They had come expecting to find a terrified diner waitress and a cowardly ex-boyfriend. They had not expected the architect of the city's underworld. "Well now," Tommy bellowed, his voice carrying over the storm. "Looks like someone beat us to the prize. Leave the girl, Costa. This ain't your business. Kyle gave her to us to clear his tab." Inside the SUV, Vincent did not even turn his head to look at the O'Bannon soldiers. He kept his dark eyes fixed on Sarah, his thumb gently stroking the unbruised side of her temple. "Dante," Vincent said softly. In the driver's seat, Dante chambered a round into his customized assault rifle. "Boss, wipe them out. Leave Tommy breathing, but take his knees. I want him to crawl back to his brother." The doors of the G-Class flew open. Silvio and Dante moved with the synchronized, lethal precision of men who had spent their entire lives fighting in the shadows. They did not shout warnings. They simply unleashed hell. The deafening roar of gunfire shattered the quiet neighborhood. Windows in the adjacent apartment buildings blew out from the concussive force. Silvio, using the reinforced steel door of the SUV as a shield, laid down a blanket of suppressing fire that instantly dropped 2 of the O'Bannon thugs before they could even raise their weapons. Tommy yelled a crude curse, diving behind the engine block of his pickup truck. Bullets sparked violently against the wet asphalt and tore through the cheap metal of the O'Bannon vehicles. Sarah screamed, burying her face into Vincent's chest. The sound of the gunfire was infinitely worse than the silence of the diner. It was the sound of death, loud and unforgiving. "Look at me," Vincent commanded, his voice cutting through her panic. He placed a warm hand on her cheek, forcing her to meet his gaze. "You are safe, Sarah. Do you hear me? The monsters outside this car are dying, and the monster who did this to your arm is a dead man walking. Focus on my voice." She stared into his eyes, finding a terrifying, absolute certainty there. He wasn't just comforting her. He was stating facts. Outside, the tide turned entirely. The heavy, rhythmic thumping of an approaching helicopter echoed above the storm clouds, followed by the screech of 4 black sedans turning onto Sycamore Drive. Carmine Valetti had arrived. The O'Bannon crew, realizing they had walked into a slaughterhouse, tried to break and run. It was useless. "Drive!" Vincent ordered Dante, who had slid back into the driver's seat, leaving Silvio to clean up the street with Carmine's men. The heavy G-Class threw off sparks as Dante threw it into gear, ramming violently through the disabled O'Bannon pickup truck, pushing it out of the way with thousands of pounds of reinforced steel. They left Sycamore Drive burning, the flames from a ruptured gas tank hissing violently against the downpour. As the SUV sped toward the city limits, Sarah finally succumbed to the overwhelming agony radiating from her shattered bones. Her eyes rolled back, and she collapsed entirely against Vincent's chest, slipping into a merciful, deep unconsciousness. Vincent adjusted his grip, pulling her closer. He looked down at the bruised, broken woman in his arms. The city lights flickered across her pale face. "Drive faster, Dante," he said, the coldness returning to his eyes. "Tell Dr. Gallagher to be scrubbed and ready. If she loses this arm, I will hold him personally responsible." Sarah drifted through a hazy, drug-induced fog for what felt like an eternity. There was pain, but it was distant, muffled by heavy intravenous painkillers. She remembered blinding white lights, the sharp smell of surgical antiseptics, and a man with kind eyes and a steady voice telling her to count backward from 10. She remembered the feeling of something cold and rigid being clamped around her forearm. When she finally opened her eyes, the world slowly swam into focus. She was not in a hospital. She was lying in a massive, 4-poster bed, draped in heavy, dark velvet. The walls were constructed of exposed, rugged stone and rich mahogany paneling. A massive stone fireplace crackled on the far wall, casting a warm, dancing light across the room. High, arched windows revealed a breathtaking, terrifying view. They were high up in the mountains, surrounded by jagged crags and dense, ancient pine forests that stretched out like a dark ocean under the moonlight. This was Vincent Costa's private estate, a veritable fortress built into the rugged frontier, miles above the city's corruption. Her left arm was heavily casted from her knuckles to her mid-bicep, elevated on a stack of silk pillows. The throbbing ache was still there, but the sickening grinding of bone was gone. "You've been asleep for nearly 20 hours, Sarah gasped, turning her head sharply. Vincent was sitting in a high-backed leather wing chair near the fireplace. He was no longer wearing the blood-soaked suit. He wore a simple, dark cashmere sweater and tailored trousers. Without the armor of his suits, he looked less like a corporate kingpin and more like a dangerous, primal force resting by the fire. "My arm," Sarah whispered, her throat dry and raspy. Vincent stood up and walked to the bedside, pouring a glass of iced water from a crystal carafe. He held it to her lips, supporting the back of her head as she drank greedily. "Dr. Gallagher is a former trauma surgeon from Johns Hopkins. He works exclusively for me now," Vincent explained, setting the glass down. The break was severe, a comminuted fracture of the radius and a clean snap of the ulna. He had to use 2 titanium plates and 14 screws to put it back together. But you will keep the arm, and with physical therapy, you will regain full mobility. Sarah looked at the heavy plaster, a wave of nauseating memories crashing over her. Kyle, the money, the horrific sound of the snap. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling over her lashes. He took everything. My savings. He took it all. Kyle Barrett is currently being hunted by every soldier on my payroll, Vincent said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, quiet octave. He will not live to see the end of the week. That is a promise, Sarah. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I'm just a waitress. I served you terrible coffee. You don't know me. Men like you. You don't burn down city blocks for a waitress." Vincent pulled a chair closer to the bed and sat down. He looked at her with a profound, unreadable expression. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn, leather-bound ledger. He set it gently on the edge of the mattress. "I don't know you, Sarah," Vincent said softly. "But I knew Sylvia Carmichael." Sarah froze. The air in the room seemed to vanish. "My grandmother? How? How could you possibly know my grandmother? She baked pies. She lived in a little house in the suburbs before she passed." Vincent offered a small, humorless smile. "Sylvia baked very good pies, yes. But 30 years ago, before I took over the syndicate, before the city was neatly divided, the underworld was a chaotic, bloody mess. My father ran this family then, and your grandmother, Sylvia, was his chief bookkeeper." Sarah stared at him, her mind completely short-circuiting. "That's a lie. She was a secretary at a shipping firm. A shipping firm that imported illegal firearms and untaxed liquor," Vincent corrected gently. "Sylvia possessed a brilliant, photographic memory. She handled the accounts for the entire commission. She knew where every dime was buried, who was being bribed, and who was skimming from the top. She was arguably the most powerful woman in the city, because she held all our secrets. When she retired, my father swore an oath to protect her bloodline. It is a debt of honor that I inherited. Sarah's head spun. The modest inheritance Kyle had gambled away. Was that mob money? The grandmother who taught her how to knit and bake was a financial mastermind for the Mafia. When Sylvia passed away, you were just a teenager, Vincent continued, his dark eyes fixed on hers. You disappeared into the foster system before my men could locate you. It took me years to track you down. When I finally found you, you were working at Mel's, living with a degenerate gambler. I started coming to the diner to observe you, to see if you had Sylvia's steel. And, Sarah whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. And I saw a woman who endured abuse with quiet dignity, saving every penny she could to build a new life for herself, without ever compromising her kind soul, Vincent said, leaning forward. But I also saw a woman who needed to realize she is not a victim. You are a Carmichael. You belong to a legacy of power, Sarah. You were never meant to serve coffee to truckers or cower before weak men like Kyle. He reached out, his warm, calloused fingers gently brushing away a tear that had fallen onto her cheek. You asked me to come get you, Vincent murmured, the intensity in his gaze burning away the last remnants of her fear. I did. But you are not a prisoner here, Sarah. When your arm heals, you can leave. I will give you the money Kyle stole, tenfold, and you can disappear. He paused, his jaw tightening, almost imperceptibly. Or you can stay. You can learn what it means to hold power in this city. You can stand by my side, and I swear to you on my life, no one will ever lay a hand on you again. The fire crackled loudly in the massive stone hearth. Sarah looked from the heavily casted arm resting on the silk pillows to the terrifying, magnificent man sitting beside her bed. The scared, bruised waitress from booth number 4 was dead, left behind on the blood-stained carpet of Sycamore Drive. She took a deep breath, the mountain air filling her lungs, and looked Vincent Costa directly in the eye. Kyle Barrett spent 3 agonizing weeks jumping at his own shadow. He had abandoned his apartment on Sycamore Drive the night he broke Sarah's arm, fleeing with her stolen $2,400 stuffed into a duffel bag. He had driven his beat-up Honda Civic straight out of the city, holing up in a roach-infested room at the Starlight Motel just off Interstate 95. He survived on stale vending machine crackers and cheap whiskey, obsessively watching the local news on a static-filled television. He expected to see reports of a mob shootout. He expected to see Tommy O'Bannon's mug shot. But the news remained terrifyingly silent. The police commissioner, deep in Vincent Costa's pocket, had ordered a complete media blackout regarding the massacre on Sycamore Drive. The silence was worse than any headline. It meant the Costa syndicate was handling the cleanup internally. It meant they were looking for him. On the 22nd night, the cheap wooden door of Kyle's motel room simply exploded inward. Kyle didn't even have time to scream. Silvio, moving with terrifying speed for a man his size, cleared the threshold and slammed the butt of a heavily modified Kimber 1911 pistol directly into Kyle's temple. Kyle crumpled to the stained carpet, his vision swimming in a sea of grey. Strong hands grabbed him by his collar, dragging him out into the freezing night air and tossing him into the trunk of an idling Audi A8. When Kyle finally regained consciousness, his hands were zip-tied behind a cold, heavy steel chair. The air smelled of damp stone and expensive cigars. He blinked violently against the harsh glare of a single overhead industrial light. He was in a vast, subterranean cellar. Racks of vintage wine stretched into the darkness, but the center of the room was cleared for a very specific, brutal purpose. Carmine Valletti stood in the shadows, calmly cleaning his fingernails with a stiletto blade. But it was the man sitting at the small wooden table in front of Kyle that made his blood run cold. Vincent Costa. Vincent was impeccably dressed in a midnight blue tailored suit, casually swirling a glass of deep red Barolo wine. He looked entirely at ease, a predator perfectly comfortable in his own domain. "Mr. Barrett," Vincent said, his voice a smooth, deadly purr that echoed off the stone walls. "You have been remarkably difficult to find, hiding in a $30 motel while the woman you abused lay on an operating table. It perfectly encapsulates the measure of your character." "Please," Kyle sobbed, struggling uselessly against the thick plastic ties biting into his wrists. "Please, Mr. Costa, I didn't know she was yours. I swear to God, Tommy O'Bannon made me do it. He threatened to kill me. I'll give you the money back. I have it. You have $2,400 of stolen Waitress tips," Vincent replied, taking a slow sip of his wine. "Do you truly believe that covers the cost of my time, the ammunition my men spent wiping the O'Bannon crew off the map, or the titanium plates currently holding Sarah's arm together?" Kyle froze. The O'Bannons are gone? "Every last one of them," Vincent confirmed coldly. "Tommy O'Bannon lost both his kneecaps before he bled out on the asphalt. But Tommy was merely a business rival, making a tactical error. You, Kyle, are something entirely different. You are a domestic parasite, and you laid your hands on something that belongs to the Carmichael legacy." Before Kyle could process the strange name drop, the heavy iron door at the far end of the cellar groaned open. The rhythmic, sharp click of expensive heels echoed against the stone floor. Kyle strained his neck to see past the harsh light. When the figure stepped into the illumination, the breath completely left his lungs. It was Sarah. But it wasn't the exhausted, terrified diner waitress in the oversized polyester uniform. She wore a sleek, tailored black trench coat over a silk emerald blouse that brought out the fierce, icy clarity in her eyes. Her hair was perfectly styled, and on her wrist gleamed a diamond-encrusted Patek Philippe watch. Her left arm was supported by a sleek, custom-fitted black carbon fiber brace, a stark reminder of his brutality. She walked past Carmine without flinching and stopped beside Vincent's chair. Vincent reached out, gently placing his hand against the small of her back. The sheer power dynamic radiating from the two of them was suffocating. "Sarah," Kyle breathed, his voice cracking with disbelief and pathetic hope. "Sarah, please. Tell them to let me go. I'm sorry. I was out of my mind. The gambling, the debts. I didn't mean to hurt you." Sarah looked down at him. For 2 years, this man had controlled her life with fear, heavy fists, and shattered plates. She had cowered in corners, applying cheap makeup over bruises, terrified of his footsteps. Now, looking at him bound to a chair, trembling and weeping, she felt absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical disgust. Vincent had been right. She had inherited Sylvia Carmichael's steel. "You didn't mean to hurt me," Sarah repeated, her voice perfectly level, devoid of any warmth. "You grabbed my arm, pinned me to the floor, and used your entire body weight to snap my bones in half, Kyle. You stole the only money I had in the world to save your own pathetic life, and then you sold me to a rival syndicate." "I was desperate," Kyle wailed, tears streaming down his face. "You were weak," Sarah corrected him, echoing the words Vincent had spoken to her in booth number 4. She turned to Vincent. The Don looked at her, his dark eyes filled with a terrifying, proud devotion. He silently offered her his own weapon, a sleek, suppressed handgun resting on the table. He was offering her the final say, the ultimate retribution. Sarah looked at the gun, then back at Kyle. The terrified mechanic squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for the end. "He isn't worth the bullet, Vincent," Sarah said smoothly, her voice echoing with newfound authority. "Killing him is too easy. A quick death is a mercy he doesn't deserve." Vincent's lips curved into a faint, dangerous smile. "What is your decree, Mea Regina?" "He owes the syndicate for the mess he caused. He owes me for my arm," Sarah said, her eyes locking onto Kyle's terrified face. "Carmine, put him on one of the deep-water freight ships heading to the Baltic Sea, the ones that don't dock for 8 months. He can work in the boiler room until his debt is paid, and if he ever steps foot in this city again." "He goes into the incinerator," Vincent finished, standing up and buttoning his jacket. He looked at Carmine. "You heard her. Get this trash out of my sight." Kyle began to scream, thrashing wildly as Silvio and Carmine descended upon him, but his cries were abruptly cut off by a swift blow to the jaw. As they dragged his unconscious body into the darkness, Sarah didn't look back. She simply rested her right hand on Vincent's arm, walking with him out of the cold cellar and up into the warmth of her new empire. The winter thaw took 6 agonizing months to finally give way to a crisp, vibrant spring across the mountain estate. For Sarah, those months were a grueling crucible of physical and psychological reconstruction. The Costa Syndicate had emerged from the Obannon conflict stronger, wealthier, and utterly untouchable, effectively absorbing the territory of their fallen rivals. But the true seismic shift in power had occurred entirely behind the heavily guarded, reinforced steel doors of Vincent Costa's Alpine fortress. The frightened, exhausted diner waitress named Sarah Bennett was dead. She had been left behind on the blood-soaked carpet of Sycamore Drive. In her place, forged in the fires of betrayal and immense pain, stood Sarah Carmichael. The physical therapy required to save her left arm had been nothing short of torture. Dr. Gallagher, the former trauma surgeon who operated out of Vincent's state-of-the-art underground clinic, was brilliant but entirely merciless in his regimen. 3 times a day, Sarah sat in the sterile, brightly lit medical bay, her teeth clenched so hard her jaw ached, while Gallagher manipulated the stiff, atrophied muscles surrounding the twin titanium plates and 14 screws embedded in her bone. There were days when the pain was so blinding, so completely overwhelming, that she wanted to scream and beg him to stop. She remembered the sickening snap, the smell of cheap whiskey, and Kyle's terrified, cowardly eyes. But every time the tears threatened to spill, she looked up and saw Vincent. The don of the city's most feared crime syndicate never missed a single therapy session. He stood in the corner of the room, dressed in immaculate, custom-tailored charcoal suits, his dark eyes fixed on her with a quiet, terrifying devotion. He didn't offer empty platitudes or tell her it would be okay. He simply anchored her. He was a silent, immovable monolith of power, silently transmitting his own boundless strength into her shattered frame. By the 7th month, the heavy plaster cast was a memory. It had been replaced by a sleek, custom-fitted black carbon fiber brace that wrapped elegantly from her knuckles to her mid-forearm. It looked less like a medical device and more like a piece of modern, tactical armor. She had regained 95% of her mobility. She could hold a coffee cup without trembling. She could type. And most importantly, she could turn the fragile, yellowed pages of Sylvia Carmichael's ledgers. Vincent had given her unrestricted access to the syndicate's most guarded sanctum, a massive, subterranean vault beneath the estate's library that housed decades of financial history. The room smelled of old paper, leather bindings, and cold stone. It was here that Sarah discovered the true magnitude of her bloodline. Her grandmother, The woman who had taught her how to bake cherry pie and knit scarves had been an absolute mathematical savant. Sylvia's ledgers were not mere accounting books. They were a complex, brilliant cipher. They mapped out the entire anatomy of the city's underworld. Every bribe paid to a sitting judge, every untaxed shipment of heavy artillery through the southern ports, every real estate shell company used to wash illicit cash. It was all beautifully, flawlessly encoded in Sylvia's elegant handwriting. Sarah spent weeks locked in that vault, surrounded by stacks of modern financial reports and her grandmother's old journals. She discovered that Sylvia's genius for numbers flowed perfectly through her own veins. The complex webs of international money laundering, the offshore holding companies in the Cayman Islands, the intricate routing numbers of private Swiss banks. None of it confused her. To Sarah, the numbers sang. They formed a perfectly logical, ruthless tapestry. It was during a deep audit of the syndicate's current shipping manifests that Sarah found the discrepancy. It was incredibly subtle, a microscopic bleed of capital hidden beneath layers of fabricated port union fees and phantom cargo insurance payouts. Someone was skimming from the Costa Syndicate, and they were doing it with an arrogance that made Sarah's blood run cold. She tracked the bleeding accounts through 3 different dummy corporations, finally pinning the stolen funds to a private offshore trust registered in Belize. The trust belonged to Harrison Croft. Harrison Croft was one of Vincent's oldest and most powerful capos. He controlled the lucrative southern docks, commanding a small army of enforcers and longshoremen. He was a brutal, old-school mobster who believed power was measured only by the weight of a gun and the fear in a man's eyes. Sarah did not take the file to Vincent in private. She understood the primal, theatrical nature of the world she now inhabited. Power had to be taken openly, under the harsh glare of the lights, or it meant nothing at all. She waited for the first Tuesday of the month, the day Vincent convened the syndicate's high council in the grand boardroom. The room was a masterpiece of intimidation, panelled in dark mahogany and dominated by a 30-foot table carved from a single slab of black walnut. Vincent sat at the head, radiating quiet lethality. Carmine Valetti, the underboss, sat to his right. Harrison Croft, his heavy frame straining the seams of an expensive Italian suit, lounged carelessly near the middle, puffing on a thick Cuban cigar. The heavy double doors swung open, operated by Dante and Silvio. The low hum of violent men discussing violent business instantly died down. Sarah walked into the room. She wasn't wearing a cocktail dress or the oversized polyester uniform of a battered waitress. She wore a razor-sharp, tailored black crepe suit that screamed authority. The carbon fiber brace on her left arm gleamed under the recessed lighting. She carried a single, thick manila folder. Harrison Croft let out a low, patronizing chuckle, exhaling a cloud of blue smoke. Vincent, with all due respect, I thought this was a closed commission. I didn't realize we were bringing the help in to take our coffee orders. Vincent did not move a muscle. His face remained entirely impassive, but the temperature in the room plummeted. He leaned back in his leather chair, steepled his fingers, and looked at Sarah. He was giving her the floor. Sarah walked the length of the table. She didn't look at Carmine, and she didn't look at the other capos. She stopped directly across from Croft and tossed the thick manila folder onto the polished walnut wood. It landed with a heavy, definitive thud. "I don't serve coffee anymore, Mr. Croft," Sarah said, her voice perfectly level, carrying the icy, ringing clarity of a struck bell. "I find the men in this room lack the palate to appreciate a decent roast. However, I have spent the last 3 weeks reviewing the Southern Dock manifests, specifically the cargo insurance payouts handled by a firm called Apex Maritime. Croft's patronizing smile faltered slightly. The cigar ash fell onto his lapel. Apex Maritime is a legitimate union contractor. It's none of your business, little girl. Apex Maritime is a shell corporation registered to a P.O. box in Nassau, Sarah corrected smoothly, her eyes locking onto his with predatory focus. A shell corporation that has been systematically overcharging the syndicate by 4.2% on every inbound container of untaxed electronics for the past 18 months. That surplus capital is then routed through a Panamanian holding company before quietly settling into a private trust in Belize. The boardroom was dead silent. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning unit. Carmine Valetti slowly stopped cleaning his fingernails with his stiletto and looked up, his eyes narrowing dangerously at Croft. "You're out of your mind," Croft spat, his face flushing a deep, mottled purple. He slammed a heavy fist onto the table. "I've bled for this family for 20 years. You think you can walk in here, some bruised-up stray the Don picked out of a gutter, and accuse me of stealing?" "I am not accusing you, Harrison. I am simply presenting the mathematics. Numbers, unlike men, do not possess the capacity to lie," Sarah replied, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm octave. "The trust in Belize is registered under your mother's maiden name. You have stolen exactly $3,412,000 from Vincent Costa, and you did it because you thought the ledgers were too complex for anyone to untangle." She leaned forward, planting her right hand and the carbon fiber brace of her left arm on the table, invading his space entirely. "You forgot who built those ledgers, Mr. Croft. I am Sylvia Carmichael's granddaughter, and I am collecting the debt." Croft lunged across the table, his face twisted in desperate rage, his hand reaching for the heavy brass ashtray to strike her. He never made it halfway. A deafening crack echoed through the mahogany room. Croft collapsed backward into his chair, a perfect, dark, crimson hole blooming in the center of his forehead. His lifeless body slumped to the floor, the expensive Cuban cigar rolling away over the plush carpet. Sarah didn't flinch. She slowly turned her head. Vincent was standing at the head of the table, a suppressed, smoking Sig Sauer pistol held loosely in his right hand. His face was a mask of cold, absolute judgment. He looked at the remaining capos, who were frozen in their seats, their faces pale with shock. Harrison Croft stole from this family, but his true crime was raising a hand toward the queen of this syndicate, Vincent said, his voice a low, rumbling earthquake that shook the foundation of the room. "Let it be known. Sarah Carmichael speaks with my voice. She sees with my eyes. Her authority is absolute. Anyone who questions her numbers or her place in this family will join Mr. Croft." Vincent holstered the weapon and walked down the length of the room. He bypassed the bleeding corpse entirely, stopping in front of Sarah. The coldness in his eyes melted away, replaced by a burning, possessive pride. He reached out, gently tracing the line of her jaw. "You found the rat in my house," Vincent murmured, his thumb brushing over her pulse point. "I told you," Sarah whispered back, the adrenaline thrumming through her veins, a wild, intoxicating high of pure power. "I know exactly how to balance a ledger." 3 months after the boardroom execution, the city was firmly, irreversibly under their shared control. It was a Tuesday evening, exactly 1 year since the night she had used a burner phone to call a monster for salvation. The grand ballroom of the Costa estate was bathed in the warm, golden glow of thousands of crystal chandelier prisms. It was the night of the annual syndicate gala, a lavish, extravagant event where the city's elite, corrupt politicians, wealthy real estate developers, and the high-ranking capos of the underworld gathered to pay their respects and secure their alliances. Vincent stood at the bottom of the grand, sweeping marble staircase, dressed in a flawless bespoke tuxedo. The elite crowd mingled around him, but his attention was entirely captivated by the woman descending from the upper level. The low hum of conversation in the massive ballroom evaporated into stunned, reverent silence. Sarah moved down the stairs with the grace of an apex predator. She wore a breathtaking, floor-length gown of deep, liquid crimson silk. The fabric clung perfectly to her silhouette, the high neckline and long sleeves projecting fierce elegance, while a daring slit up the thigh hinted at the absolute danger lurking just beneath the surface. Her dark hair was swept up into an intricate, flawless style, exposing the delicate line of her neck and the blinding, multi-million-dollar diamond choker Vincent had clasped around her throat just an hour prior. The men in the room, hardened killers and arrogant billionaires alike, parted like the sea. They didn't just see a beautiful woman. They saw the architect of their financial empire. They saw the woman who had effortlessly dismantled Harrison Croft. They saw true, terrifying power. Vincent stepped forward, taking her hand as she reached the bottom step. He pressed a slow, deliberate kiss to her knuckles, his eyes never leaving hers. "You command the room without saying a word," Vincent murmured, pulling her flush against his chest, claiming her entirely in front of the most dangerous men in the state. "They don't fear the dress, Vincent," Sarah whispered, a wicked, triumphant smile playing on her lips as she rested her hand against the lapel of his tuxedo. "They fear the mind behind it, and they fear the man standing beside me." "Let them fear us both," Vincent replied, a genuine, rare smile softening the lethal edges of his face. He kissed her, a deep, consuming claim that sent a ripple of absolute submission through the watching crowd. There was no question of who ruled the city. The king had found his queen, and their reign would be written in gold and blood. As the orchestra struck up a slow, sweeping waltz, Vincent led Sarah onto the center of the marble floor. She leaned into his embrace, the terrifying memories of broken bones and a dingy diner fading into the absolute certainty of her new empire. She was no longer a victim waiting to be saved. She was exactly where she belonged, ruling the shadows by his side. And that concludes the dramatic, twisting saga of Sarah Carmichael and Vincent Costa. From the gritty, terrifying floors of a broken apartment to the dizzying heights of absolute underworld power, this story proves that sometimes the darkest moments forge the strongest steel. Did Sarah make the right choice in sparing Kyle, or should the syndicate have taken a more brutal revenge? What was your favorite twist in this Mafia romance?